This particular incident happened almost a decade ago, when I was around 10 years old or so. I think I should stress before starting that my parents are not really pranksters. Even in the most regular of social situations where everyone's joking around and messing with each other, they're usually straight to the point. So I have no reason at all to believe they were lying this time. It was the camping trip my dad had been looking forward to every day since the snow melted into springtime. He'd requested a week off of work in late June so that we could all go up to his favorite chunk of forest, this state park about an hour's drive away from where we lived. It would be a good family activity. We get set up on the campground, us two kids in one tent, my older brother and I, and my parents in the other. The first day actually went pretty great. There was a lot of splashing around in the river, hiking, doing lots of fun family stuff. My brother and I very rarely ever got along, but this was one of those rare moments when we were really enjoying each other's company. Anyway, the sun started to set, casting everything in gold. Then night found the four of us sitting around the campfire making s'mores together. I remember getting really spooked by all the noises I could hear in the distance. My parents were just constantly telling me to calm down. They reminded me that there were other campers there as well. It's a state park after all, and this was the biggest time of year for other campers. Also, there were no doubt lots of small furry animals like raccoons or squirrels or whatever running around out there in the darkness. This did actually ease my nerves a lot. For a moment or so, I could have sworn I'd heard a very particular sound nearby though. I knew that sound from all the games of hide and seek I'd play often as a kid. It was the sound of someone trying to hold their breath, but too excited to fall completely silent. I only heard it for a brief moment though, and then it was gone like it had never been there at all. The real event happened the next night though. All four of us were out in our tents, my brother fast asleep in the sleeping bag right next to me. I have a lot of body warmth on account of my chubbiness, so I had unzipped my bag and was just laying there staring into the darkness. I was trying to fall asleep to the soft lullaby of Mother Nature and whatnot, but it really just wasn't coming to me. I reached over and, as delicately as possible, slipped my brother's old flip phone out of his pillowcase, where I knew he liked to keep it safe. I don't remember the time exactly, but I could see it was in the very early morning. Back when I was that age, I very rarely ever stayed up after 10 p.m. I'm in college now, so that's obviously a different story. So it was weird when nearby I could hear a zipping sound. I thought it was probably coming from my parents' tent. Thinking that somehow my dad had known I was awake, I quickly slipped the phone back into the pillowcase and fell back into a sleeping position. Muffled footsteps, the crunching of gravel, the snapping of twigs. They all came closer towards our tent, then came to a stop right outside the tent flap. "Dad?" I asked after a moment, whispering so as to not wake my brother.
"Hey, I'm going to the bathrooms. Do you need to go too?"
The person outside the tent called in. Remembering that the bathrooms, that big building in the middle of the campgrounds that held the showers and toilet stalls, were in the direction my dad was walking anyway, I realized I did have to pee. Yeah, hold on, give me a second," I replied. I quietly got up and stepped gingerly over my older brother, slipped on my flip-flops, and exited the tent. Sure enough, some ways down the gravel pathway that led to the bright light of the bathrooms was the big, bulky silhouette of my father. He was too far away though, and the light too glaring to see him clearly. I walked after him, shivering slightly in the wind. It wasn't too cold, but it was way colder than the tent had been. I got to the bathrooms, and my dad had disappeared, probably already in one of the stalls since I couldn't find him anywhere in there. I went into a stall to do my business. He exited his without flushing, and then he left the building again without washing his hands either. I finished up and followed quickly after him. "Hey, Dad, wait!" I called out to him, picking up speed to catch up. The bulky silhouette waved a hand toward me and headed to a different angle of the trees than we'd come from. This confused me, and I stopped.
"Hey, come on, this is a shortcut,"
my dad said. I realized that I'd never actually seen the face of the person I was following the entire night, so I started to get a little bit nervous. "That's a dumb shortcut. I'm going this way." I headed back toward the actual direction of the campsite. Then the man got impatient.
"Get over here right now. We're going this way, you little shit."
My dad had never sworn at me before. Immediately, the alarm bell started ringing. I turned around and ran as fast as I could, finding our camping spot and diving into my parents' tent. To my surprise, I found my parents both wide awake, playing cards under the light of a tiny electronic lamp. I asked my dad if he'd gone to the bathrooms at all that night, to which he replied no. My parents had woken up a few minutes beforehand by what they thought was a raccoon snooping around our trash bag. That's when they decided they couldn't really sleep, so they should stay up and play cards together. Well, I told them about what had just happened. My parents got out of the tent and searched around the area, but they couldn't find anyone. To this day, I can't decide if it was actually a man trying to lure me into the forest, or if I just had a bad dream or something. I was a pretty imaginative kid back then, and knowing how my brain is even better now, I don't entirely trust myself to know what was the truth at that age. For example, I'd once run a red light swearing up and down for the last 18 years that green had meant stop and red had meant go. I remember going to the store once wearing socks with flip-flops, but standing in the checkout line realizing I had shoes on. Another time, I triple-checked to make sure my car was locked in a parking lot and came back to find it completely unlocked and my car's disappeared from my pocket, sitting in the driver's seat. So sometimes my mind lapses. I'm not really sure what to make of it. My mother is a primary school teacher in a rural town in Australia. About 10 years ago, she was offered the principal position at a tiny mountain school about an hour away from where we lived. This mountain town was kind of a long-running joke for us townies. Just mentioning it would cause any local to start humming the dueling banjos theme from Deliverance. The population was just under 40 people. Most of them had the same last name, and they were all pretty well known for keeping it in the family. However, being promoted from teacher to principal was a pretty big deal for my mom. We decided we'd all live at the old schoolhouse during the week and come back to civilization on the weekends. When we arrived, I was shocked at just how small this town actually was. One street surrounded by thick scrub and brushland, dilapidated houses tucked away out of sight from the main road. No streetlights, no shops. The school was tiny, with only about 14 kids in total, and all related to each other in some way. I hate to say it, but some of the students had that Innsmouth look, if you know what I mean, that only comes with generations of kissing cousins. But overall, they were all really nice actually. All the kids behaved well, and my mom enjoyed her new job a lot. I had just finished high school and was waiting for university to start, so I spent most of my days alone in the schoolhouse reading or cooking, while my siblings were away at school and my parents were at work. However, as the weeks progressed, I found myself spending more and more time at the school itself helping mom, because I just couldn't stand being alone there. With no TV reception and only an old Walkman and some shitty cassette tapes to fill the silence, I found myself rapidly fluctuating between bored and extremely paranoid most of the time. There were always a lot of sudden and random old house noises that really didn't sound like they were the house at all. Scratching, shuffling sounds at odd times that frequently sounded like footsteps or perhaps even voices. I tried to pass it off as paranoia for as long as I could, but shit finally hit the fan one day. I had just happened to stop my tape mid-song when I distinctly heard a man's voice quietly whispering random numbers from the front veranda. 40, 40, 9, 40, 17. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but I am afraid of hillbilly home invasions, so I took off to the school and reported it to my mother, who of course did not believe me. Then I went to my father, who didn't believe me either. My sister did though, at least. She said she hadn't slept well since she was awoken nights before by the sound of a branch scraping on her bedroom window. Only catch was, there was no tree around. She told me she thought she had seen a man standing in the backyard late one night too, but when she mustered the courage to look once more, he was gone. Pretty soon, we were the first teenage sisters to ever insist upon sharing a room together. My parents both thought we were being ridiculous. However, one evening after dinner, we were visited by two of the local men who told them something that changed their mind. After asking if we'd had any trouble at the house, they proceeded to tell us that everyone in town had been experiencing trouble for over a month now. Apparently, these men dressed in makeshift camouflage gear had been wandering down along the main street at night. It came to the town's attention because while the town was used to strangers in hunting gear, these guys were covered in leaves and grass and sticks. No one knew who they were. Definitely not the locals of the town. There were at least 10 different people, always traveling alone and always dressed in that same weird camouflage clothing. At first, the locals of the town were just having a laugh about it. It certainly wasn't common to see people dressed as walking bushes outside of a Warner Bros. Cartoon, even during hunting season. It was very absurd and funny, at least at first, until these guys started sneaking onto private property. One lady had woken up to find something moving under her house, shining a flashlight up through the floorboards. Another man had come home to find a camouflaged guy hiding crouched on his roof. One man heard muttering from his back porch, only to go out and discover that someone had unchained his hunting dogs from their run and tied them to his back doorknob, then drawn a large X on the door. Pretty much every local had been terrorized by one of these guys in the night, and some of them even brazenly during the day. The local guys were really nice actually, and warned my dad to keep things locked up tight and stay vigilant, and let them know if anything happened. Over the course of the next month, many similar events occurred. My mother even saw one of the men hiding on the edge of the school grounds during the day and called the police. The sightings were frequent, as were the chalk X's. One of the locals even saw a man in camouflage standing on his front lawn whimpering like an animal in the early hours of the morning. The local guy who'd seen him threatened him while his wife called the police, but the man silently stood his ground, smiling at them in the dark. The local man eventually lost his cool and beat the heck out of this creeper, who stood there smiling and laughing through the entire beating, then just got up and walked calmly back into the bush, still smiling and even bleeding before the police arrived. Unfortunately, there's not really a cool ending to this story. The school closed not long after due to government funding cuts, and my mom got a new job closer to home, which meant we left pretty quickly. We moved back home after spending only 5 months up in mountain country, and no one in the family was too sorry about that. I often wonder who those guys were to be out there in the middle of nowhere, and why were they doing all of that exactly? When I was growing up, my older brother raced flat-track motorcycles, and as a result, my dad and him were gone for most weekends during the racing season. Sometimes my mom, my younger sister, and myself would tag along, but my mom was never really that into it. Instead, usually she'd keep my sister and I home most of the time and plan out some fun things to do together for us girls during the weekend. This incident happened on one of those weekends where we'd stayed back home in 1987. I was about 10 years old, and my sister was 8. It started out just like any other Saturday, with my dad and brother gone off on their trip. My mom took us out to eat McDonald's, and we went to the mall and then went home to play some Monopoly and watch cable. At around 10 p.m., my sister and I started to get pretty sleepy, so my mom brought out the sleeping bags for all 3 of us to sleep in the living room together. I had to ask my mom years later what time this was, because as a kid, I really didn't pay attention to the clock much. Sometime around 2 a.m., someone started banging on our front door. Our front door was pretty strange. It had 4 large panes of glass that weren't opaque, so they were covered with small curtains. We all woke up to this pounding and rushed to the door to look out one of the windows. We could see there was a girl standing at the door, probably in her late teens. I remember her wearing a white and blue windbreaker. She was frantic and crying and begged my mom to let her in. She said her boyfriend was chasing her and she was afraid he was going to kill her. My mom remained calm as hell in that scary situation. "I'm sorry, love. I can't let you in because I've got 2 young children with me. I can't risk your boyfriend harming them if he gets in. I'll call the police for you, so just stay right where you are." Of course, that didn't sit well with the girl. She started crying more and pointed to her foot that was broken and in a cast. "Please, ma'am, you have to let me in. He's coming right now." Again, my mom politely refused and turned and ran into the kitchen. Then she dialed 911. Our phone was mounted on the wall in the kitchen with a ridiculously long cord, so she was able to go back to the door while on the phone with dispatch. She told the girl the police were now on their way. This made the girl go even more insane. "I don't need the police. I'll be dead before they get here." My mom apologized again and said she was sorry, but she was not going to open the door. At this point, the girl just kind of turned around and walked off into the darkness. About 5 to 7 minutes later, the police showed up. My mom gave a statement, and as she was doing so, my dad and brother returned home from their race. My dad hadn't even turned off the truck yet. He just ran up and looked terrified, asking what was happening. My mom was telling my dad what had happened when another officer walked up and said he hadn't seen anyone, but he did find a shoe in the street just in front of our house. The police left and we all sat down in the living room for a bit to decompress. I remember thinking that maybe my mom hadn't been very nice to that girl and should have just let her in and helped her. Fast forward to around 2001. It was about a week after I'd given birth to my first son. Family and friends were at my house and doting on my new baby. After most people left, there was just my parents, my sister, me, and my son, sitting in my living room this time. I made a comment about how I didn't really love the neighborhood we'd moved to, but I was proud of actually having my own home with my husband. All of a sudden, my sister said, "Hey, Mom, you remember that lady that came to our door demanding to come in?" At that point, I could tell my mom and dad weren't comfortable talking about it because they gave each other nervous glances. My sister, being the asshole she can be sometimes, said, "Well, why didn't you just let her in? I wonder if her boyfriend did end up killing her." My dad interjected. My mom had done the right thing because it was late and we were home alone. Then he added this little neat tidbit. Plus, they ended up finding her in a car with her boyfriend smoking dope just a few blocks over. They had a rope, duct tape, 2 shovels, and a shit ton of knives in the trunk. My sister and I both shouted in unison, "What?" I asked why we were never told about that, and my dad said they decided not to tell us so we wouldn't feel unsafe in our own home. Finding this out made me feel like a huge jerk because I always thought my mom was being really mean, and I wondered if that girl had gotten hurt. Now I know my mom most likely prevented a home invasion with her tough but correct decision to deny the girl entry into our home. This happened 4 years ago. I was a sophomore in college, and I typically avoided relationships, if they weren't mine or if they were. Mostly because of how busy college kept me. I was a journalism major, you see. I think you get the point anyway. Apart from romantic things, though, I had pretty healthy relationships with all of my friends and went out quite a bit as well. My roommate Piper had this boyfriend she brought over every night, and yes, only to bang. It was boring and I got tired of hearing all the fucking all the time, so I decided to move out. A month or 2 later, I moved in with my new roommate Jenna. Piper and her boyfriend broke up. It wasn't your average, "it's not you, it's me" breakup though. It was for a bigger reason, and apparently I was involved as well. Piper texted me at 10 p.m. and said the following, "How fucking dare you? Must you really destroy my happiness?" Of course, I texted back, "What the fuck are you talking about?" She proceeded to tell me her boyfriend said he couldn't be with her because he had feelings for someone else, and that someone else was me. I was completely caught off guard, needless to say. Dude, I don't even know him. Get over it. All you two did was fuck all the time anyway. I left it there. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was blown up with texts. I didn't even bother checking. I just clicked all the notifications away. For the next few weeks, though, weird events started occurring. I'd noticed sometimes that some of my jewelry was missing, or even noticed a smashed photo of me and my mom on the ground one night when I got home. After that, I remember going up to Jenna and yelling at her for doing this, but she insisted that it wasn't her. The complete sincerity in her voice told me that she wasn't lying. She had nothing to be mad at me for anyway. Nobody else knew about the spare key under the plant outside our door but Jenna and I, though, so someone would have had to deliberately look for some way to get inside. I checked the plant, and sure enough, the key was missing. I called campus security, and the next day they sent 2 men over to check out everything. They didn't find anything in particular, but they did say we should talk to the advisor ASAP to get our locks changed. I really didn't want to go through all the hassle. Of course, now I regret not doing that at first, but the story must continue on. A day or so later, someone knocked at our door, and to my surprise, it was Piper's ex-boyfriend. Hey, Piper has been sending me all these threats. Can you text her to chill out? She says you two still text all the time. I was very confused. I haven't talked to her in weeks. Sorry, dude, I can't help you. Call CS. No, I don't think you get this. The threats are really bad. Here, I'll show you. I agreed to see what he was talking about, and what he showed me completely disgusted me. This girl was sick. Since he chose not to report it, the only thing I could do was tell him to stay safe. That night, I was working on a paper on some writer and what he did on certain projects or whatever, when I kept hearing footsteps in my living room. I got up to go check because it was weird. Jenna would not usually be awake at 3 a.m. All I could think is maybe she'd gotten up to go get food or something. I walked out and it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything except the lamp from my room, illuminating just a bit of the couch. Jenna, is that you? I waited, only to hear a voice call out. Yeah, I have a headache, so I'm gonna go to the store. It was not Jenna's voice, though. I made a brave decision to play along. Alright, hold on, Jenna, let me get you some money. I won't turn on the light, okay? I heard the voice silently whisper, okay. I walked back to my room and looked for any sort of weapon. I turned off the light and stood there in the doorframe. And come here, the light's off so it won't strain your eyes. The person started walking towards the frame. The only weapon I had was a very sharp hanger I had broken off a while back. The person came closer. As I heard her footsteps nearing, I remembered there was a light switch next to my door, and I flipped it on. The light flooded into the room, and I guess he was stunned by the light. To my horror, I saw Piper's ex-boyfriend standing there. I quickly thrusted my foot at his knee and kicked him in the groin as well. He fell over onto the floor, and I screamed out Jenna's name. Jenna rushed in and screamed as well, and I told her to call the police as soon as possible. She pulled her phone off the counter and quickly dialed someone up. I noticed that in his hand was the key from underneath the pot. This whole time I figured it was Piper doing all this snooping around, and Piper would have been the one I would have seen when I switched the light on. I was so wrong. Eventually, the police came and took him down to the station and took a statement from me as well. I called and called the police a few days after the incident, but they wouldn't tell me a single word. Luckily, Jenna's brother worked for the police station, and she invited him over to get the details because he was assigned to work on that case as well as some others. He'd asked me a bunch of questions about what texts I'd received and all that in the initial burst of notifications. Only problem was, I hadn't actually checked what they said. I showed him the messages though, and what he asked next chilled me. Did Piper usually write like that? I finally looked at the texts and realized they were nothing like how Piper would talk. After that, he told me everything. Apparently, Piper's ex was not the one who broke up with Piper. Piper had broken up with him, and he'd gotten so mad he'd beat her down and stole her phone. Apparently, he'd always had some weird infatuation with me. Long story short, the sick creep was breaking into my house, pretending to be Piper, and sending threats to himself and I in order to receive my sympathy. The most disturbing thing was that there was rope in his jacket pocket. What he planned to do with it, I don't know, but it's extremely disconcerting to think about. After hearing all of that, it was enough to make me decide to file a restraining order. He couldn't be anywhere near me in a 100-mile radius. I moved schools soon after and went to a bigger city in Northern California. He got put in jail for a short time, and now 4 years later, I still keep in touch with Jenna. Jenna told me that when he'd got out, he'd asked a lot about me to anyone who might have known where I'd gone. No one told him though, because it was a small town and word traveled fast. Apparently, he found a girlfriend and moved away somewhere I don't really care to know at all. I just hope that either his girlfriend is as crazy as he is or is smart enough to leave on her own. Piper and I reconnected as well when I was in my senior year in my new college, and we're still friends to this day. It freaks me out to know that he was in the same dorm with me and pretending to be my friend, and I had no clue at all.